Welcome back to our study through the book of Isaiah. This is video number 8 in the series, and unfortunately I failed to mention something to you before. This is a ministry of the Port Huron Church of Christ. We're at 756 17th Street in Port Huron. And we would just like to let you know that even though these video lessons and other things will continue online after we reopen, we would like you to know that you are invited to anything and everything ever going on. So with that in mind, this is again video number 8 in our series going through Isaiah. We are looking at Isaiah chapter 7. So if you want to turn there in your Bibles, I'll do a quick recap here and mention a few things. First off, please remember that we stated in previous videos that to a Jewish author, getting the exact chronology in a certain order wasn't a big deal to them. They're kind of looking at things in a panoramic view, or maybe even in an ADD kind of view. I have a son that's kind of sporadic like that, and studying Scripture is kind of the way he thinks at times. Some of you may struggle with this as well. You're kind of zoned in on a subject, and then something else catches your eye, and boom, you're off and running with that. Sometimes Jewish authors can be the same way. So this is one of those instances where the timing may be a little bit confusing. Several videos ago, we also mentioned that the call of Isaiah in chapter 6 seems to be a little out of place. Why wasn't the call and the commission of Isaiah placed in the front of the book? And we discussed the different options of that and about allowing God to have the first say in the writing, among other reasons. But this is one of those instances where we've already seen the big picture of Israel being unfaithful to God with idolatry, and Judah down in the south holding out a little bit longer, but eventually they would also succumb to idolatry and the punishment that God is bringing to them. And I think it's noteworthy to mention that even though, like, the prophet Isaiah knew that Judah would also fall to idolatry, there was a process that God was going to take them through. A process of still giving them the chance to learn some lessons on the way, a chance to remain faithful, so that they could really see that idolatry was as serious as Yahweh said it was. So we're going to kind of back the truck up just a little bit. We are in chapter 7, so chronology-wise, we're kind of backing up. This is going to show us more detail about why God was doing what he was doing and what it was he was up to. Also, it's noteworthy to remind you that even though the nation was split into two parts, the northern nation was called Israel. They had their own king, their own capital city, and the southern part was called Judah, with its own kings and its own capital city. The capital city in northern Israel was Samaria at the time. The capital city down south in Judah was Jerusalem. Sometimes the northern kingdom was also referred to as Ephraim. Ephraim was simply the name of the largest tribe that owned the largest amount of land in the nation. So sometimes Ephraim, Israel, they were the same thing. It's the same nation. It was just a different terminology that they used at times. So when you read that, understand that Ephraim is the same thing as Israel, northern Israel. So with that in mind, let's take a look at chapter 7, and we're going to see three players in this next scene here. We're going to have Ahaz, who is the king of Judah down south. Now, Ahaz is actually the grandson of Uzziah. All right? So Ahaz is the king of Judah. And then we have a guy by the name of Rezin, and he is the king of Aram. Aram was a nation that was just northeast of northern Israel. They had usually been They weren't friendly, but in times of trouble, we will see that the king of Israel, who is our third player, his name is Pekah. He is the king of northern Israel. That this guy and the king of Aram are going to make an alliance. And Aram isn't particularly a good guy. This is not a friendly nation. They're out for themselves. So Rezin, the king of Aram, makes a deal with Pekah, the king of northern Israel, and he says, okay, look, dude, we'll join forces, and I will help you under one condition. We have to go together down south, beat up Judah, and that way, we'll split the treasure among ourselves. So this was the alliance that was made. The threat of Assyria, way off, had been looming. There had been prophets to warn northern Israel that Assyria was coming. And so the king of Israel is trying to prevent it. He's trying to do something about it, and he's going to make an alliance with this other pagan nation to the northeast of him. And that's the deal. We'll join forces if we go down south, beat up your cousins, and take all their stuff. So that's the deal with the nation of Aram. And because of this alliance between northern Israel and Aram, the people of Judah, who are still, they're remaining faithful to God for the time being. They're hanging on by a thread, but they're trying. They hear of this alliance and they're frightened. They're very scared because now all of a sudden there's going to be this huge army that's going to come down and try and beat them up. So because of this fear, Isaiah the prophet, who remember he prophesied to southern Judah, God tells Isaiah, go find the king of Judah, and this is what I want you to tell him. So here we go, Isaiah chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. When Ahaz the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now remember, Jerusalem is the capital city of southern Judah. Now all the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. This is the alliance we were just talking about. So the hearts of Ahaz, who's down south, and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. They were scared. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the lauder's field, and say to him, be careful, keep calm, and do not be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood. Because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, and the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin. They have said, let us invade Judah. Let's tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Now this son of Tabeel was a puppet king. He was somebody that could be easily controlled. And yet this is what God says. This is what the sovereign Lord says about what you're worried about. Here's God's response. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only King Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim, or northern Israel, will be too shattered to even be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. So here is the alliance that we have just talked about. They're trying to unite against a common threat of Syria, but the hitch is we're going to go down and beat up Judah first. The king of Aram, the king of Israel, plotting against Judah, and God says, don't sweat it. Don't worry about it. In fact, within 65 years, all your cousins up north, that whole nation of northern Israel, 10 of the 12 total tribes, they're going to be so shattered they won't even be able to unite and call themselves a people. So this is what's happening now in the timeline. All right. Now, as you look at the next several passages in chapter 7, things can become confusing unless we do something. You're going to read about Isaiah telling King Ahaz to ask for a sign. And Ahaz is going to respond in a way that we would think, good for you, Ahaz, you're not supposed to test God. And we're thinking this because of things we have read in the New Testament. You should not put the Lord your God to the test, was something that Jesus answered the devil during his temptation after 40 days fasting in the wilderness. And we've heard Jesus say that a wicked, adulterous generation asks for a sign, so you shouldn't do that. Here's what I'm asking you to do as we study Isaiah. You need to take what you know about the New Testament and just put it on the back burner for a moment. We will circle back to it. But when we look at the Old Testament text, remember the first thing we want to do is answer the question of what would that text have meant to the original audience, the original people reading it, the original people that were living it. And remember, these folks they didn't have the New Testament. They didn't have Jesus' example. So it's not an issue of God changing the way he does things. It's a matter of timing. And in this case, as we read Ahaz's response to Isaiah and to God, we're going to see that he actually messed up. Okay? So here we go. This is Isaiah chapter 7. We're going to look at verse 10 now. Verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. This is actually through Isaiah. Right? Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. So Isaiah is telling King Ahaz, hey, king, what I have just told you is really from God. And God has just promised you that, regardless of what northern Israel and the nation of Aram is doing, don't worry about it. Don't be afraid. It's not going to amount to anything. Don't let it shake you. God's with you. Don't sweat it. But the thing is that, so Isaiah tells Ahaz, ask God for anything, any kind of miraculous happening, any kind of sign or wonder, just so that you understand that it really is God saying this. Ahaz doesn't ask. He doesn't want to. And when we read Ahaz's response, we think, well, good for him, because, like I said, you're not supposed to test God. But remember, original context. Okay? So look at verse 12. This is Ahaz's response. Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Like I said, this sounds rather pious, rather righteous. But Ahaz is not asking for a sign because he doesn't actually believe Isaiah. How do we know this? We know this because King Ahaz would, in just a few more chapters, he would go and ask the king of Assyria for help against this alliance between Israel and Aram. So Ahaz isn't trying to be a pious, righteous, don't test God kind of guy. The problem is he really doesn't believe Isaiah. And so Isaiah's response is, okay, you're not going to ask for a sign? Well, God is going to give you one anyway. So here we go in verse 13. Then Isaiah said, hear now, listen, you house of David. So he was speaking to the king, Ahaz, in southern Judah. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you now try the patience of my God as well? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings that you are dreading will be laid to waste. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So this sign, this is a big thing, especially in the New Testament, the sign of Emmanuel. The name does mean God with us. And again, before we jump ahead to the Christmas story about Jesus, try to stay focused on what it would have meant to these people in this context. And then when we understand that, it will just enrich everything that you already do know about the Christmas story. Okay? So here we have this description, this Emmanuel. Now remember, this is a sign for the nation of Judah, who is still under God's favor for the time being. They're hanging on by a thread, but they are hanging on. All right? They're starting to struggle with idolatry, but they haven't gone off the deep end yet. So this sign of a young woman, which is the word in Hebrew for virgin, would mean a young, able to marry woman who isn't married yet. So what's happening here is that he says, okay, King Ahaz, here's what's going to happen. You're worried about these two kings, but there's going to be a young maiden, a virgin, who gets married. She's going to have a kid. They're going to name him Emmanuel. Here's the thing. You're not going to tell him what to name the kid. This is just going to be the name that he's given with no prompting from anybody other than God. And you're going to hear about it. And before this kid knows the difference between right and wrong, the alliance between northern Israel and the nation of Aram, their whole place is going to be laid waste. In other words, in just a few years, 2 to 3 years, you're going to see the whole land taken out, and the alliance, and so that meant the northern kingdom of Israel. So here's some more about the sign of Emmanuel. It talked about Judah was going to see Ephraim or Israel conquered and laid to waste. And so remember, the prophecy was for the nation of Judah, who was still being obedient to God. When he talks about the child eating curds and honey, this is not a throwback to the glory days of entering the promised land. The curds and honey, we're going to see here in the next section of passages, that the curds and honey were because the animals didn't have young. And he's going to talk about flies and bees and things like this. So remember, this prophecy is for Judah, but it's something that Judah is going to witness happen to northern Israel. Verse 18. In that day, the Lord will whistle from flies from the Nile Delta in Egypt, and for bees from the land of Assyria. Real quick, here's what this means. The flies coming from Egypt, the Egyptian soldiers were so numerous and so bothersome, they were like flies. And Assyrian soldiers were known to be vicious, and people of that day would compare a single Assyrian soldier to being attacked by a swarm of bees. They were just vicious, they were painful, and they were ruthless. So the flies and the bees are about the soldiers that God is going to use from Egypt and from Assyria. Verse 19. They will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the crevices in the rocks and all the thorn bushes and all the water holes. In other words, soldiers are going to be everywhere. Foreign soldiers will be everywhere in the land of northern Israel, or Ephraim. Verse 20. In that day, the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River. And now he's going to be specific about telling you what this razor is. The king of Assyria. So here, Isaiah is prophesying, and he is telling Ahaz, you're worried about Ephraim and Aram. Watch what God does. He's going to bring soldiers from Egypt and from Assyria. And this guy, the soldiers are going to be numerous like flies, vicious like bees, and the king himself is going to be like a razor to shave you down, all right? To shave Israel, northern Israel down. The king of Assyria, to shave your head and your private parts and to cut your beards. In that day, a person will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats. This is verse 22 now. And because of the abundance of the milk they give, there will be curds to eat. And all who remain in the land will eat curds and honey. Now, that almost sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? But it's not. So, again, you've got this multitude of soldiers that are going to settle into the northern land of Ephraim or Israel. And he talks about a young cow and 2 young goats and all the milk that they're going to produce. Like I said, this is not a good thing because a single cow and a couple small goats, normally they're going to be producing so much milk because their young are going to be gone. The Egyptians and the Assyrians are going to completely wipe out northern Israel, even to the point where they take the animals aren't having young anymore. And that's why there's an abundance of milk. And when he talks about the honey, eating curds and honey, it'll be because the land is so, it's not being worked anymore. And in this case, now he's talking about natural bees, where there will be an abundance of beehives and honey because the land is destitute. So I know it kind of sounds like a good thing, but it's not. It's kind of like when you, maybe you buy an old farmhouse and it's full of bees because nobody has lived there in any amount of time. Yeah, there would be a lot of honey in those beehives, but there's going to be bees everywhere because the place hasn't been taken care of. So that's what's going on here in this prophecy of Isaiah. In verse 23, moving on, he says, in that day, in every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels, there will be only briars and thorns. Again, this is a reference to the land being overrun because there's no one left to tend it because they've all been destroyed. Verse 24, hunters will go there with bow and arrow. Again, because what used to be farmland is going to be like natural, the wild again. For the land will be covered with briars and thorns. Verse 25, as for all the hills that were once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of the briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep just run. So, to recap again, chapter 7 is good news for the small nation of Judah down south, bad news for the northern nation of Israel, also called Ephraim. This prophecy given to King Ahaz of Judah is to calm the hearts of the people. So what do we learn about this? Well, several things. Obviously, we see that God is in charge of the whole picture. So regardless of what the king of Israel and the king of Aram were plotting, God can always intervene, and he can always bring about something more drastic in order, if that's what it takes to bring his plans to fruition. We also learn that even though it sounds like Ahaz is doing a good thing by not testing God, look, when God tells you to ask something of him, do what he tells you. All right? Sometimes as 21st century American Christians, we can get caught up in this false sense of humility. And when God is telling you, hey, change something in your life, change your heart, change your attitude, and we get this false sense of humility, like, no, I'm not worthy to receive God's grace or anything like that. I think it just upsets God a bit. If he tells you to do something, do it. Okay. We also see the sign of Emmanuel being something very different than what we are accustomed to in hearing the Christmas story. We mentioned this a couple videos ago, where this sign of Emmanuel, this young woman who would become married, have a child by natural means, name him Emmanuel, and before the kid's 2 or 3 years old, this alliance up north is going to be done away with. So the king doesn't have to worry about it. This prophecy would have, well, it did. It came to fulfillment in the days of Ahaz. This alliance would, of course, be wiped out. Within 65 years, the entire northern nation of Israel was shattered because they were all carted off into exile into Assyria. There was like a remnant, a small portion of people that remained in the land, but there weren't enough people there to take care of it. So God will always bring his promises about. We see prophecy fulfilled in the days of Isaiah, and we would also see this prophecy of Emmanuel, which means, the name means God with us. We would see it come to an even greater fulfillment in the time of Christ. Obviously, with Mary, not only beginning as a virgin, but even the gospel writer Matthew makes it a point to tell us that her marriage to Joseph was not consummated until after Jesus was born. So in the case of Mary and Jesus, it was a genuine virgin birth, where in Isaiah's day there was a virgin, which would have been any young woman that was pure and of age to marry. She did it the natural way. She got married, she got pregnant, she had a child, they named him Emmanuel. Right? And within a couple of years of that, this alliance up north had been destroyed, and the people it wasn't a problem for the people of Judah. So we learned that issue of prophecy being fulfilled in that time, only to be fulfilled again in a greater way down the road. And that, of course, is up to God's discretion, how he does things. But that's the deal with the whole issue of the child named Emmanuel in the day of Isaiah. It also teaches us something about God's timing. God spared southern tribe of Judah. In fact, when he first started off, he kind of gave you the answer before he gave you how it was going to take place. It said in chapter 7, verse 1, that Israel marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. So he gave you the end of the story before he gave you the whole who was marching and why. Okay? So sometimes God does that. In fact, he's already told us the end of the story, that Christ will return, and that if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you win. That's the end of the story. And what happens between now and then, well, there could be a lot of details that we don't understand. But what we do want to keep in mind is that God's timing is just that, God's timing. And so what we want to do is we want to strive to follow him wherever and whenever he leads. And the best way to do that is to not make the mistake of Israel or Judah, but to simply take God at his word, trust him, and be faithful to him with the things that you already know please him. So I pray that this video has found you well, and until next time, God bless.